In this video, I'm going to talk about the presidential election's politics disadvantage and how you can strategically read the new unbroken scenario that is included in this video. So let's start with the basics. What is the politics disad to begin with? Well, the politics disad is a type of disadvantage that is a broad category that encompasses a lot of different types of disadvantages that generally talk about things that happen in Washington, D.C. and the political environment. This disadvantage historically comes from policy debate, and not to try to toot my own horn, but I think I've probably coached the politics disad more than any other position in debate, because when I coached with DB, oftentimes the 1&R only went for 5 minutes of the politics disad, and that's something that's really strategic in policy debate, but I'll leave that for a different time and place. But the politics disad can be broken down into a bunch of different categories. There are a lot of politics disads that talk about agenda items that happen during the year. So should the farm bill be passed by Congress? Should it not be passed by Congress? And would the enactment of the resolution, if it is a claim of policy, sort of change that, or would it not? That would be an agenda politics disad. There's all sorts of other politics disad. So for instance, for this video, we're going to talk about a specific type of elections disad called the presidential elections disad, which is really timely for the next month and then really not a thing for the next couple of years. So hopefully you watch this video in the next month and aren't finding it after the presidential election. But if not, I think that this will still be really helpful because it talks about how we need to get more specific with these positions rather than talking about them in generalities. So the presidential elections disad would say one candidate is winning now, but the action of the affirmative would change that and would cause the other candidate to win. This is not just for presidential elections. You could have the congressional elections, you could have different governor races, you could have runoff elections, all sorts of different things like this. But traditionally, people are really drawn to the presidential election because it has really large implications, typically, that you can take advantage of in a debate. I will leave all of those disadvantages that are not the presidential elections disad to another place and time, but for the scope of this video, I want to talk specifically about the presidential elections disad for the 2024 election. So the base version of this disad that we're going to talk about is going to be what I'm going to call the Harris-Good disadvantage. This is basically going to say a uniqueness story that says that Vice President Harris is currently going to win the presidential election, but that something the affirmative does causes Harris to lose the election, and that Harris losing or Trump winning has some sort of negative implication. And that is going to be the general story that most people are going to read, or at least that I have seen different teams read on this topic. So let's jump into what an example of that looks like right now. So let's start with a base example. This disadvantage is the politics disadvantage that my debaters read at the UK season opener, and we're going to go through it, and then we're going to criticize it. So first, the disadvantage has a uniqueness story that says that Vice President Harris is up, meaning that they are going to win the election now, but the living wage is unpopular and causes President or Vice President Harris to not win the election. And this link particularly is based on inflation and the economy, and that the perception of inflation will cause Vice President Harris to lose the election, and that inflation is that deciding voting issue, and that a Trump 2.0 presidency would be bad for numerous reasons. So basically, this disadvantage says Harris wins now, but something the affirmative does causes Harris to lose the election, and Trump winning the election is bad. However, if we really look at this disadvantage, it's really, really, really too simplistic. It doesn't really make sense with the sort of complicated nature of how the election works and how voting works in America. I think that a disadvantage, which I'm going to talk about later and is included in this video, that talks about specific issues, specific people, and geography are going to be the best versions of this presidential elections disad. I think that this version does one thing of those three where it specifies a specific issue. It says inflation is going to be the number one thing that voters are going to look at. Harris is winning now because voters are sort of assuaged with their inflation concerns, but the affirmative causes a lot of inflation, which causes voters to flip sides. I think that this makes a great story about a specific issue, but really doesn't compute in terms of a specific group of people who are going to change their vote or matter, or a specific state or geography that matters. So I think that, there's maybe parts of this uniqueness evidence that talks about swing states and Georgia, North Carolina, all sorts of places like that. But I think that the actual way that disad works needs to be a lot more specific, because the presidential election is not a popularity contest. It's not like student government in high school. It has a really specific way that it works, and I think that teams that use this to deploy their disads in a more strategic fashion will ratchet up more wins over the course of the topic, because it makes these disads a lot more strategic. Let's sort of flip to the map right now and talk about how this works. I want to flip it over to the Electoral College Map so that we can get a better idea of why geography really matters and why the version of the disad that we just saw is probably too simplistic. The reason for this is that each state gets a specific number of electoral votes, and that is how the presidency is decided. So once a candidate gets 270 electoral votes, they win the election. The way that those votes are determined is they are distributed by the number of House members and Senator members plus DC. So for instance, in California has 54 electoral votes. That's because California has 52 members in the House and 2 senators. In 48 states plus DC, it is winner take all. So in California, if you win the popular vote, you win all those votes. However, in Maine and in Nebraska, it is proportional. So that will matter for some specific votes, but maybe not enough to turn the tide of a whole election. The reason that I want to talk about this is that specific states are really going to matter. For instance, if we look at a map of the 2020 election and look at California, you will see that Biden beat Trump by over 5 million votes. So if your disad said 1 million people in California get mad at Harris and vote for Trump instead, probably not enough to change the election. So we need to talk about specific states that are capable of sort of changing the tide in the election. And this really matters because this is what's really going to sort of swing the direction in one candidate or the other. 2016 is a great example about why specific states matter, because Trump won by not very many electoral votes or popular votes if we really look at some specific states. So again, I want to look at this map for a second, because a lot of the states that are in blue, a lot of the states that are in red probably aren't going to matter in terms of our disadvantage, because those states are already largely going to vote for one candidate or the other. The ones that you see in the tan color, the toss-up color, is the votes that are going to matter for the election more. So if we look at these states, these are going to be the states that are actually going to determine the election. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, etc. And those races could change by several thousand votes, and that could swing the whole election. Again, if we look back at 2016, Trump won Wisconsin by 20,000 votes, Michigan by like 12,000 votes, Pennsylvania by 50,000 votes. I'm pretty sure if you switch those votes, which is less than 100,000 votes, that Clinton would win the presidency, because those three states electoral votes would change from one to the other. So this is why getting really specific about specific states matter, because as well as being strategic, it's going to make it so that a lot of the things your opponent says doesn't apply. If you're talking about Michigan and your opponent is talking about the popular vote in the nation, those things don't apply, and you are going to win the debate on the specificity of the state geography that you have talked about, because that geography plays a major role in how the electoral votes are decided in an election. So the tip that I have for you in terms of the presidential elections disad, and in terms of the disad that I made for this video, is that you should get really specific in terms of the geography that you have for your disadvantage. I also think that this is important because when you get to the specific people part of this, that it is going to allow you to talk about those people more. So if we look at voters, for instance, generally lots of people already have their mind made up. So your sort of Democrats don't like it or Republicans don't like it, links don't work, because those people have already voted, and there's nothing that you, maybe not already voted, I guess early voting just started, but they have sort of already made up their mind, so that nothing that you're going to do with the affirmative is going to change how they're going to vote. People are going to vote for Trump or Harris no matter what. What you have to look at is what votes could actually matter. Are they independent voters, undecided voters, moderates, veterans, women, sort of different races or ethnicities? All of these are specific ways or specific specific ways that you can access this presidential elections disad better, because you need to talk about how specific people are going to change their opinion of the candidates and how that is going to change the election. So if Pennsylvania is only going to be won by 5,000 votes, maybe 5,000 undecided voters in one county could really change the election, and the action of the affirmative could really change how those voters view a candidate. So I think that getting really specific about the people is going to matter as well. The last thing that I want to talk about, I already talked about this at the beginning, but you should try to get specific about the issues. The problem with this is that we often want to say that the affirmative is the biggest issue. The problem with this is that rarely is anything but the economy the thing that voters care about. So I think that both teams should think about this. I think that the disad that I showed earlier that was talking about inflation is probably one of the better issues to talk about, and a good version of this that talked about how inflation was the number one deciding voting issue for the 2024 election. This is probably a good issue to talk about in terms of the strategy for this disad, because that's going to be what voters actually care about. Rarely do things like foreign policy or a lot of the minutia affirmatives that we talk about matter. The number one things that voters want to talk about when we talk about these specific issues is the economy. So I think that it's smart to relate it back to the economy if you can, or at least have some version of the card that I have up here that's like, this is the thing that decides the election, because without that, you're just going to get trumped by a bunch of different other issues that the other team is going to bring up. So that's sort of how I think a good presidential elections disad should be structured to be strategic. Now I want to jump into the elections disad that I have for this video, which I'm going to talk about now. So, the part you've been waiting for, or that you just skipped to. This past weekend, the teams that I coach went to a tournament, had prepared this presidential elections disad to read, and we never got a chance to read it, and I don't think we are going to another tournament on the topic, or another tournament that the presidential elections disad will be a thing, at least in the capacity that this disad is written. So I thought that I would share it to the masses as a good example of some of the things that I just talked about. I have two different versions of this, but if you don't want to listen to anything else that I have to say, if you look below in the description, there is a link where you can download this whole file and just do that yourself. But if you want to stay tuned, here is what I got for you. So this disadvantage is the same type of disadvantage. It is a Harris-Good disadvantage, but it is specific to issues, region, and a place, a geography, a group of people. So the long version of the disadvantage is what I'm going to start with. Then I'm going to go through the short version, and then you can explore this for yourself by downloading it in the link below. So the disad starts by saying that Harris is beating Trump in Erie County, Pennsylvania now, and that Erie County, Pennsylvania is the key county that swings the entire state of Pennsylvania, and that the 19 votes that Pennsylvania has in the presidential election are going to determine the presidential election. It says that these Erie County voters are what really determines Pennsylvania, and that determines the White House. And just like the disad that I started with, it says that inflation and the economy are going to be the key specific issue. The reason this is important is you're just going to be able to substitute in your generic plan hurts inflation, the specific AF hurts the inflation link, and be ready to go for this. This has some extra cards you could probably take out. You can do what you want to do, but says that Pennsylvania and its 19 electoral votes are important and the only way for each candidate to be able to win the election. So remember the disad we had originally that said Harris wins. Plan changes that. Well, this disad takes a more specific turn and says that nothing else matters except for the state of Pennsylvania, and specifically that inside of Pennsylvania, Erie County voters are the only voters who are going to determine the election because they are the swing county in a swing state, and then says inflation and the economy are the key issues that they care about, and says that, whatever candidate is better for those things. Currently, I guess they think Harris is that candidate, will win the election. However, by doing the affirmative, that will change the aspect of how they view inflation and that candidate, and they will change their vote. I included a specific piece of evidence that I cut earlier in the topic that says that this inflation issue is what drives the election, and that fear of inflation is what will cause voters to go in one direction or another, and then a generic impact card. If we look at the shorter version of this disadvantage, it says that Harris has a slim lead in Erie County right now, and that county in Pennsylvania is the key way to win the election. However, this link is a little different because it goes into a specific group of people. Remember, I talked about how it's not only a specific issue or a specific place, but it often is a specific group of people that matters. This version of this disadvantage specifies that there are a certain number of undecided voters in Erie, and that those voters, which total in the thousands of voters, will vote determined based on their perception of the economy, and that Trump would use the inflation concerns that the plan would create in order to relink Harris to Biden's unpopularity, which would cause them to vote for Trump and would allow Trump to win Erie and thus win the White House. This piece of evidence is particularly good, and this story is good because if the affirmative is talking about inflation in general, or a specific group of people who change their votes, or general people who change their votes, it just doesn't matter because you are specifying a specific type of voter and why they are really important. So I think that this would allow you to get out of some of the arguments that the other team might make against your disadvantage. There's a bunch of other cards that I included in here, some for the overview, some for the links, some that I stole from college, some link turns that I've just been sitting on the whole topic. Hopefully y'all will use this to your advantage over the next month while we are getting ready for the wealth tax topic. So hopefully this was a good little rundown of this specific presidential elections disad, talking about Erie, Pennsylvania. Again, remember, you can just download the whole thing in the comments below. It'll take you to a link that you should be able to get all of this. So hopefully you find this helpful, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.